This is VOA News. I'm Marissa Melton. U.S. President Donald Trump said Tuesday he will be looking very carefully at how his labor secretary, Alexander Acosta, agreed to a light sentence in a child sex trafficking Jeffrey Epstein more than a decade ago when Acosta was a federal prosecutor in Florida. Trump has defended his labor secretary, saying many people were involved in the Epstein case. A federal appeals court says President Trump can't ban critics from his Twitter account. AP correspondent Shelley Adler reports.
A three-judge panel has agreed with a lower court judge who said President Trump violates the First Amendment when he blocks critics. The ruling came in a case brought by the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. It had sued on behalf of seven of his policies. The appeals court said the First Amendment does not permit a public official using a social media account to exclude people from an otherwise open online dialogue because they disagree with the official. I'm Shelley Adler.
A who's who of conservative groups are headed to the White House to discuss how to deal with reports and stories from social media. Two of the biggest players in the social media world, Twitter and Facebook, have reportedly been excluded from the White House event. Few details are available about the July 11th gathering, but U.S. President Donald Trump has increasingly criticized the three big social media firms, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, for censorship and bias against conservative voices. The U.S. State Department has approved a request by Taiwan to purchase an estimated $2.2 billion worth of military equipment. China has called on the United States to immediately cancel the deal, saying it violates the One China policy. The U.S. has diplomatic relations with China but is bound by law to supply arms to Taiwan. This is VOA News. A senior UN official, has provided an update on the situation in Sudan on behalf of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Lisa Schlein reports for VOA from Geneva.
Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights Andrew Gilmore says he is encouraged by the agreement reached Friday between Sudan's Forces for Freedom and Change and the Transitional Military Council. But he says it will take a lot of perseverance after months of violent protests, which finally succeeded in toppling longtime President Omar al-Bashir. Unfortunately, Gilmore notes the removal of Bashir did not end violence or abuse in the country. He says civilians opposed to continued military rule have been subject to widespread human rights violations and violent repression of protests. Lisa Schlein for VOA News, Geneva.
As governments and international organizations around the world condemn last week's bombing of a migrant detention center in Libya that killed more than 50 civilians and wounded at least 130. VOA's Heather Murdoch reports from Tripoli, where desperate migrants are still trying to travel.
This is the sound of a quiet protest behind the walls of a compound where hundreds of migrants remain detained outside. Naima, who has been living here for about a week, says her Tripoli home is still in a war zone.
So the house completely is not good. There is no door, there is no window, so it's not safe to stay.
At a detention center in the suburbs, other women and children languish. It is getting harder and harder to cross to Europe, she says, because of closing seaports and growing anti-immigration sentiment in the Western world. But like many migrants, Mercy says, for her, there is no going back. Heather Murdoch, VOA News, Tripoli.
Russian lawmakers voted unanimously on Tuesday in favor of a resolution calling for sanctions against neighboring Georgia amid increased tension between the two countries. Russia's lower house of parliament, the Duma, recommended that Moscow institute sanctions over Georgia's quote, unfriendly actions. The chairman of the Duma said the lawmaking body wanted a ban on Georgian wine and mineral water in Russia, as well as a stop to money flowing from Russia to Georgia. Relations between the two nations have been strained in recent weeks. In late June, protests turned violent between activists and police following the appearance of a Russian lawmaker in Georgian parliament. On Sunday, relations worsened after a Georgian television host gave a profane monologue critical of Russian President Vladimir Putin on live television. I'm Marissa Melton. You've been listening to VOA News.